So first, sticking into this model just productivity, and if you'd remember back to what my productivity pictures were, Mexican productivity is so bad that when we stick these productivity patterns into them, and Chile productivity is not that great, when we stick that into the model, we get kind of the difference, but we miss the levels. Then we stick the taxes in. Oh my gosh. Did I do this right, or did I get the dotted lines and solid lines mixed up? You know, they look so similar, I can never remember what's the model and what's the data. It's a joke? Okay. Nearly all the differences in the recoveries in Mexico and Chile come from different paths of productivities. Tax reforms are important and, in fact, necessary to explain some features of the recoveries, not the differences. Implications for studying different stories about what is causing the differences is that we need to look at reforms as those that show up in productivities, not as differences in factor inputs. They also have to get the timing right. So then we go through all kinds of stories. There were fiscal reforms in both countries. Yeah, we've already said they're important, but not for the differences. We've already gotten enough as we possibly could out of those. Trade reforms, and those of you who know me know that with my friend Jaime Serra from Mexico, who came with me to Spain in 1984-85 to start working on Spanish integration into the European community. He was the Secretary of Trade and Industry in Mexico who negotiated the NAFTA with the United States, and I was his economic advisor, and we thought the secret to getting growth going again in Mexico was going to be trade reform. Well, we got a lot of increases in trade, but it didn't seem to work in getting things going. Privatization, now we hear people talking about good and bad privatization. I hadn't heard about that early on. Mexico, as a matter of fact, Chile did its privatization long before the period we're talking about. Mexico did massive privatization just during the period when it was stagnating. Unless we're into these long and variable lags like Milton Friedman, I don't see that working. Instead, I'm going to think it's the banking system. Chile took over its banks. I wish in the United States we could have taken over our banks 2 years ago. It took over the banks that accounted for more than 50% of deposits. And within 2 years, it had them all privatized again, or out of business. Mexico kept the banks nationalized during the whole period of the 1990s. It set low deposit rates, and the loans were not made at any kind of market interest rate. They're usually negative real interest rates, either to the government or directed by the government to firms that the government favored. That's going to be my story. You see that the Mexican banking system, and Mexicans are concerned about this, especially now that much of the Mexican banking system is controlled by the Spanish. There was some hope when Ernesto Zedillo, another classmate of mine from Yale, when he became president, and in the first year of the crisis, he decided that Mexico was supposed to open up its banking system to US and Canadian participation within 10 years. He said, let's do it right away. And in fact, let's let the Europeans in, which in practice meant the Spaniards. And in Mexico, my bank account is actually in a bank that's owned by one of your rivals, Pep, BBVA, but they're pretty famous for, you know, this policy of having just very high lending rates and not particularly making any loans to the private sector. And in fact, Guillermo Ortiz, the previous governor of the Banco de Mexico, spent a long time yelling at them, and that was all in the press. Bringing in Spanish owners didn't mean that they lent money out like they do in Spain. And instead, Mexico has virtually no private credit to firms. So I'm thinking of a sort of model with heterogeneous firms. People come up with ideas. They need to get credit to put those into effect. And in Mexico, you're not going to get it from the banking system. And then if something goes wrong, what happens? Well, in practice, we've seen Chile set up a system where firms could go out of business. Mexico pretty much doesn't. And I thought that they had, partially reacting to the criticism of how things had gone in 94, 95, that they totally reformed their banking laws. But someone has told me, a friend of mine at the Banco de Mexico, so I don't want to implicate him, that actually those laws were written by too many lawyers, and they're actually unusable. So these are the kind of things that stop firms from moving in and out of industries. This is the kind of things that lead to capital and labor getting stuck in bad firms. I don't mean bad in a moral sense, I mean an economic sense. They're inefficient, they're not growing, they're not creative. They're not the things that cause economic growth. In fact, when we tried to come up with a picture like this for Mexico, couldn't do it. Even though I had the research assistant of a minister, or secretaries as they call them in Mexico, helping me, they said data like this doesn't exist because we don't have anything that administers what you call bankruptcies. Okay, so what do we learn? Let me wrap up a bit, and especially now my concluding remarks about Spain and the United States. Studying the experience of Great Depressions teaches us, or at least taught me and Ed Prescott, that massive public interventions in the economy to maintain employment and investment during a financial crisis can, if they distort incentives enough, lead to a Great Depression. Or think of a country that experienced no growth at all between 1948 and about 1994, India. So it wasn't a crisis. They just thought, you can't let there be unemployment. You have to maintain investment. So they had a thing called the sick mills policy. You run a big manufacturing firm. At the end of the year, you go in and see your a government official. He says, well, how much money did you lose? 50 million rupees. But you maintain employment and investment. Here's a check. That kind of policy in India for this period of 50 years made India, at least according to an extension of this way of thinking, experience no growth at all. Human suffering involved in this kind of thing is incredible.